nothing else but an odd lot of medieval hand weapons. There were quite a bit of those about, in museums, personal collections, and not a decorative dud among them. These were real, tough and tested. They became part of British life again, ordinary citizens traipsing about with a mace or a halberd or double-bladed battle-axe. I myself became rather adept with this claymore, although you wouldn't think of it to look at me.
He gestures, slightly embarrassed, to the weapon almost as long as himself.
It's not really ideal. It takes a lot of skill, but eventually you learn what you can do, what you never thought you were capable of, what others around you are capable of.
David hesitates before speaking. He is clearly uncomfortable. I hold out my hand. Thank you so much for taking the time.
There's more.
If you're not comfortable...
No, please, it's quite all right.
Forbes takes a breath.
She wouldn't leave, you see. She insisted, over the objections of Parliament, of the Prime Minister, of her own family, to remain at Windsor. As she put it, for the duration. I thought maybe it was misguided nobility, or maybe fear-based paralysis. I tried to make her see reason, begged her almost on my knees. Hadn't she done enough with the Balmoral Decree, turning all her estates into protected zones for anyone who could reach and defend them? Why not join her family in Ireland or the Isle of Man? Or at least, if she was insisting on remaining in Britain, Supreme Command headquarters north of the Antonine.
What did she say?
The highest of distinctions is service to others.
He clears his throat. His upper lip quivers for a second.
Her father had said that. It was the reason he had refused to run to Canada during the Second World War. The reason her mother had spent the Blitz visiting civilians huddled in the tube stations beneath London. The same reason to this day we remain a united kingdom. They were viewed very much like castles, I suppose, as crumbling, obsolete relics with no real modern function other than as tourist attractions. But when the skies darkened and the nation called, both reawoke to the meaning of their existence. One shielded our bodies, the other our souls.
Ulithi Atoll, Federated States of Micronesia. During World War II, this vast coral atoll served as the main forward base for the United States Pacific Fleet. During World War Z, it sheltered not only American naval vessels, but hundreds of civilian ships as well. One of those ships was the UNS Ural, the first broadcast hub of Radio Free Earth. Now a museum to the achievements of the project, she is the focus of the British documentary, Words at War. One of the subjects interviewed for this documentary is Bharati Palshigar.
Ignorance was the enemy. Lies and superstition, misinformation, disinformation. Sometimes no information at all. Ignorance killed billions of people. Ignorance caused the zombie war. Imagine if we had known then what we know now. Imagine if the undead virus had been as understood as, say, tuberculosis was. Imagine if the world's citizens, or at least those charged with protecting those citizens, had known exactly what they were facing. Ignorance was the real enemy, and cold, hard facts were the weapons. When I first joined Radio Free Earth, it was still called the International Program for Health and Safety Information. The title, Radio Free Earth, came from the individuals and communities who monitored our broadcasts. It was the first real international venture, barely a few months after the South African plan, and years before the conference at Honolulu. Just like the rest of the world based their survival strategies on Redica, our genesis was rooted in Radio Ubunye.
What was Radio Ubunye?
South Africa's broadcast to its isolated citizens. Because they didn't have the resources for material aid, the only assistance the government could render was information. They were the first, at least to my knowledge, to begin these regular multilingual broadcasts. Not only did they offer practical survival skills, they went so far as to collect and address each and every falsehood circulating among their citizens. What we did was take the template of Radio Obunye and adapt it for the global community. I came aboard, literally at the very beginning, as the Ural's reactors were just being put back online. The Ural was a former vessel of the Soviet, then the Russian Federal Navy. Back then, the SSV-33 had been many things: a command and control ship, a missile tracking platform, an electronic surveillance vessel. Unfortunately, she was also a white elephant, because her systems, they tell me, were too complicated even for her own crew. She had spent the majority of her career tied to a pier at the Vladivostok naval base, providing additional electrical power for the facility. I am not an engineer, so I don't know how they managed to replace her spent fuel rods or convert her massive communication facilities to interface with the global satellite network. I specialize in languages, specifically those of the Indian subcontinent. Myself and Mr. Verma, just the two of us to cover 1 billion people. Well, at that point it was still 1 billion. Mr. Verma had found me in the refugee camp in Sri Lanka. He was a translator, I was an interpreter. We had worked together several years before at our country's embassy in London. We thought it'd been hard work then. We had no idea. It was a maddening grind. 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. I don't know when we slept. There was so much raw data, so many dispatches arriving every minute. Much of it had to do with basic survival. How to purify water, create an indoor greenhouse, culture and process mold spore for penicillin. This mind-numbing copy would often be punctuated with facts and terms that I had never heard of before. I'd never heard the term quisling or feral. I didn't know what a lobo was or the false miracle cure of phalanx. All I knew was that, suddenly, there was a uniformed man shoving a collection of words before my eyes and telling me, "We need this in Marathi and ready to record in 15 minutes.
What kind of misinformation were you combating?
Where do you want me to begin? Medical? Scientific? Military? Spiritual? Psychological? The psychological aspect I found the most maddening. People wanted so badly to anthropomorphize the walking blight. In war, in a conventional war, that is, we spend so much time trying to dehumanize the enemy, to create an emotional distance. We would make up stories or derogatory titles. When I think about what my father used to call Muslims, and now in this war it seemed that everyone was trying desperately to find some shred of a connection to their enemy, to put a human face on something that was so unmistakably inhuman.
Can you give me some examples?
There were so many misconceptions. Zombies were somehow intelligent. They could feel and adapt, use tools and even some human weapons. They carried memories of their former existence, or they could be communicated with and trained like some kind of pet. It was heartbreaking, having to debunk one misguided myth after another. The civilian survival guide helped, but was still severely limited.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes. You could see it was clearly written by an American. The references to SUVs and personal firearms. There was no taking into account the cultural differences, the various indigenous solutions people believed would save them from the undead.
Such as?
I'd rather not give too many details, not without tacitly condemning the entire people group from which this solution originated. As an Indian, I had to deal with many aspects of my own culture that had turned self-destructive. There was Varanasi, one of the oldest cities on earth near the place where Buddha supposedly preached his first sermon and where thousands of Hindu pilgrims came each year to die. In normal, pre-war conditions, the road would be littered with corpses. Now these corpses were rising to attack. Varanasi was one of the hottest white zones, a nexus of living death. This nexus covered almost the entire length of the Ganges. Its healing powers had been scientifically assessed decades before the war. Something to do with the high oxygenation rate of the waters. Tragic. Millions